So thank you. So I'm Catherine Eichelman, and I'm a master gardener from last year's class. And so I'm going to talk about attracting pollinators to your garden. So let me share my screen. There we go. And I'll go on to
Coming forth.
slideshow.
Okay, we can see the screen. You'll just want to make it slide presentation and
Better. Okay. That, yeah. There we go. Does it look
there it
like
is.
all right?
We got it.
Okay, so let's minimize this. And there we go. Okay. All right. So I don't know if you see this. I've got a little box up here that says start rehearsing. So I think yeah, this comes with the PowerPoint. But all right. So what I am doing, what I'm going to talk about is in general, some of the pollinators that are in the area. And then then my personal experiences and why I picked what I picked. So if you can see this, we'll go to the next slide and just let me know if you can't see something or at any point if you have some questions. All right. So what I'm going to cover are local pollinators, the top three based on advice from others and research, their life cycle, what their requirements are for food and temperature, requirements for nesting and their flight paths, and then I'll go to my garden and then some references. So for our local pollinators, and this is what I'm talking about, is the Pacific Northwest, which is and west of the Cascades, because we have a little bit different mix east of the Cascades. So in general, what we have are bees, and they tend to be the best pollinators for us. Then butterflies and moths, they hit different flowers and have different methods and time of day. Birds, beetles, flies, bats, and even wind and water. Those are all ways that plants, trees can get pollinated. I am going to focus on my top three, which are three bee types. So it's going to be the mason bee and blue orchard bee, the bumblebee, and the honeybee. So other bees that are in the area are the leaf cutter bee, the sweat bee, the digger bee, and the carpenter bee. So there are some basic drawings of these different bees. You might recognize some of them. They're not really to size because I think they've got the bumblebee about the same size as a honeybee and tends to be a little bit bigger and rounder. So here is a picture of the leaf cutter. It is usually later in the season, more of a summer pollinator where it's active. And then the sweat bee, which shows more like a green metallic on its head and body area. Carpenter bee, there's a large carpenter bee and a small carpenter bee. And you can see the large carpenter bee has the yellow, so it could get mistaken as maybe as a bumblebee. And then the small one looks a little bit more like a wasp to me. But those are other types of bees in our area. And then a digger bee. So again, I am going to focus on the three main and active bees in our area, which are the mason bee, the bumblebee, and the honeybee. So here's what a mason bee or a blue orchard bee is. There's multiple species of mason bees. So blue orchard is another species. It's a little bit bigger, but they basically look like this. They look kind of like fuzzy flies. And unfortunately, they get mistaken as flies. And if they get around the house, I know I've heard of people that have swatted them or they put out fly traps or something and they get caught in those. So with mason bees, they actually have a life cycle, a total life cycle of only about a year in the whole scheme. So the egg or the larva is created, placed in a cell in April through October. And then that becomes dormant. It's in a cocoon, and it could be dormant and winterized October through March. And then it hatches, and there's an active adult from mid-March through June. In total, once they hatch, they only live about 6 weeks. So that's the shortest lifespan in general for these bees. And typically the males hatch first, 1 to 2 weeks ahead of the females. The females hatch and they lay eggs, and then they all die off. So in this case, there is not an adult that carries through and winters over. So their active time is more mid-March through June. So April is typically when they're hatching. Right now is when they are, based on the weather, should all be hatching. And then they'll be active for May and into June. There we go. The next one is a bumblebee. And you can see it is a more distinctive look. It's got that yellow band. I think most of us have seen bumblebees one way or the other, either through books or you've seen them yourself in your garden or someplace. And their life cycle is about 6 to 8 months, except for the queen. So an active mated queen from the previous season she'll be active from March through April, and because she's establishing a nest during that time. So if you've seen them, they're typically low to the ground. So, and their nests are below ground typically, or in ground level wood piles or leaf piles. So when they're looking for other nests, and they're looking for places to create their own, lay their eggs and so on. So they'll create a nest then, and they will actually breed their whole colony. And so it'll be April through October. So they're active for quite a long period of time. So through all of the warmer months. And that is when they're doing their pollination. Then the workers will all die off. The males will die off, and most of the other females will die off unless they have been mated. And then the mated queens go dormant from October through March. So you see, as far as pollination, you just have the queen being active from March and April. And so she's doing some pollinating, but it's not as widespread because she's really looking for a nest. Then in May through October is where your pollination is really happening. And then the third one is the honeybee. Pretty familiar with that. And the body is similar to a mason bee, but it's got all the gold, and it's not fuzzy throughout. So I'll just look at, you can see the wings are transparent, and I'm going to go back to the mason bee. You see the wings are transparent to a little bit, some black on the bumblebee, and they look a little darker on the mason bees. We'll go back to the honeybee. Their life cycle, it can be much longer. The queens are typically living 1 to 2 years, but they can live up to 7 years. They have workers and drones that live anywhere from 2 weeks to 5 months, depending on what their job assignment is. And an active hive is March through October. So that's when most of the pollination is done. And then depending on the weather conditions, the hive will go dormant from October through March. So again, for pollination purposes, they are active and doing that pollination work from March through October. So using those three, seeing that they have different time frames that they're active and are doing the pollination, I also wanted to look at what their other requirements were. It turns out for temperature, they all are active from about between 60 degrees and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, the wind and the rain can impact that. They're not going to be active when it's pouring rain or extremely windy. If we hit, now most of these are all active during the day, which of course correlates to the weather. And then at night, they get very lethargic, or if it's a cold day, at really the mid-50s and below. So for water, they have different water requirements. The mason bee needs water or mud to create the plugs that when they're laying their eggs, it's kind of in a tubular sense, and they can do about 7 eggs per tube. So they'll lay an egg, put some food in, and then put a mud plug in before they do the next egg. So they do need access to mud. Bumblebees need water, but they typically can get it off of the water of a plant. So if they're in a yard where the plants are being watered, they can get it that way. And then honeybees actually need water for thinning their honey and cooling their hive. So definitely different demands for different reasons. So when you're thinking about your garden and what you want to pollinate, also need to consider your water and your mud sources. And in general, the different bees have different preferences for the types of blooms they use, they go to. So for a mason bee, I call them like a smasher. They like to just kind of fly right into the blossom. So they need an open bloom, not they don't do well with like a deep trumpet shaped flower. They can do somewhat, but it's different than what a hummingbird might do, what some other smaller animal or insects might do that can actually get into that trumpet shape. So they are better with a single open bloom. So some of like the ornamental cherries, things that have a multi petaled bloom or multi blossom where it's like a clump, that's not quite as good if they have to get into it. If they can be on the top of it, then they'll be fine. But they tend to need open access. The bumblebee can do different aspects. So they're not as picky as the type of blooms that they need, because it's really based on what their tongue length is. And then, of course, what they'll do is more pollen and nectar adhere to their fuzzy legs and their body. So they're collecting things as they go. Then honeybees have a shorter tongue. So again, they're not as adept to use to feed out of the trumpet-shaped flowers. But what they do like is once they've established a flight pattern from their nest, they like to have all of the same type of blossom at once. So if you are planting for a pollinator or for honeybees, try and put the same sort of thing in the same area, because that seems to be what their preference is if it's lilacs or if it's a maple or something, then they like to get and load up all from the same type of plant. All right. And at any point, if you have any questions, please feel free to either put it in the chat or just speak up. All right. So then as far as I broke down between trees and then shrubs and flowers. So the mason bees are very good with the fruit trees. And it happens because of their early hatching. Then they like apple, pear, plum, peach, really like big leaf maple. So although that's not a fruit tree. Then in general, bumbles like maple. So all of the bees like the maple. Then, but the honeybees have a little bit more variety in that they'll do linden, hazel, redbud, crepe myrtle, and horse chestnut. And so some of these are later in the season. For shrubs and flowers, they all like dandelions. So it's a great excuse not to weed the grass or to let something grow for a while. Mason bees like Andromeda, blueberries, blackberries, hyacinths, even though those are not quite open type buds, they are short enough that they can feed off of them. And then bumblebees are good with some of our herbs, or rosemary, lavender, honeysuckle, Oregon grape, huckleberry, ninebark. And this is not an extensive list, it's just to give you some ideas. And honeybees like blue flowers as well as dandelions, but so flowers that have that blue color attract them, and they like milkweed, knotweed, sunflower, and since they go a little later, they can also help with the herbs. All right. So to do a comparison on the life cycles and when they're active to do the pollination, here's a little chart. So between the three bees. So as you can see, the mason bee is active really March through June. So 6 weeks in there from when it hatches, and you would need to have food right away. So it doesn't help if they hatch the 1st of March and you don't have any trees or flowers that are blooming. They will go and find someplace else to go feed. The bumblebee, the queen, is active March in April, and then the rest of the nest is May through October. And then honeybees are active really the whole time with the hive. So as you can see, the mason bees have a much shorter lifetime and they cover an earlier part of what's blooming and what they can pollinate. Honeybees are probably the most comprehensive, but they have other requirements for nesting, so that may make them that not as easily accessible for you. All right. Okay, so we'll just go into nesting. The nesting for a mason bee in nature are tubular cavities. So that could be a woodpecker's hole, something else that's burrowed, usually not a wide diameter, so something fairly narrow, not more than 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch. So hollow twigs, old beetle burrows, or even vacant nests of carpenter bees. So it's very specific of what it's looking for. And they don't typically do the burrowing themselves. So they're not like the carpenter bees. They do not if there's a hole in your siding or wood piles, they'll use them, but they don't typically, or they don't actually drill in or burrow in to create the holes themselves. So that's why I'm saying naturally occurring tubular cavities. Now the bumblebees are ground level and underground. So they like their nests either in an abandoned rodent burrow. So if you have possibly mole tunnels or other types of things in the grass. You might find them. Yes, I see them in the bark and the landscaping. They may be in a stacked wood pile, or if you have some old leaves that are all stacked up, they might make a nest there. So again, those are ground level. Honeybees are in nature inside trees or inside a structure. So they will never be out in the open, not like a wasp nest or anything. They are actually inside something. So that may be a harder place to have a hive naturally on your property. Now, the flight pattern for each of them is a little bit different also. Mason bees only go 300 feet from their nest. So think of a sphere. If you have a nest that's on maybe you've put some twigs or something, they've made a nest in a wood pile, and they'll go 300 feet up and all the way around. But that's it. If they can't get enough food within the 300 feet, they will probably fly off and have a nest someplace else. With the bumblebees, again, they're low to the ground, but they can range as much as, well, they can range a few miles, but once they've actually located an area with enough food, they will keep it within a mile and typically try and shorten their route as much as possible. So that's a big difference between the 300-foot radius. And then even a bigger difference when you come to the honeybees. They can have a 2-mile radius. It can go longer, but the average is about a 2-mile radius from the hive. So again, depending on what you're trying to attract to your garden and what you have, that can make a difference, making sure that you have enough food for them to populate their hives. All right. So what you can do with nesting is you can create some. So if you've decided that you want to attract these, you can up your chances by creating the nests. One, make sure for all of these that anywhere near the nest, you don't want to do any pesticides. That'll help. With mason bees, you can do bee houses, or they're also called bee boxes, and you can put straws or inserts. I'll show you some pictures of those. And you can actually place that in something that meets all the requirements. There is plenty of blossoms at the right time within 300 feet. There's some water and some ways to do mud. That would be a way to determine where to place your mason bee box. Bumblebees, I haven't really heard too many ways to actually create that, but I suppose you could create some piles, some leaf piles or bark piles to attract bumblebees. And then honeybees can have, there's a whole industry of honeybee hives that you can place in the right position. And of course, if you're going to get into beekeeping, that's a whole another topic. Okay, so now that I've got the basis, what I wanted to decide for my garden is what was the best fit. So knowing that pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther, or the male part of the flower, to the stigma, which is the female part. Without pollination, there is little or no fruit. While foraging for nectar and pollen, bees touch the anthers and stigma of flowers, transferring the pollen. So that is the method. So this is what I wanted to encourage. And I had to ask myself, what do I want to pollinate? And then once I've decided that, what can I do to improve the situation? Can I change the temperature? Can I change the food and water? Can I change the nesting? And what I wanted was to up the pollination of the 2 fruit trees I have. I've been at this place in Longview for 2 years now. In the first year, there were 2 dwarf pear trees that had lots of blossoms, but in total across the 2 trees, I only got 1 pear. So that was my goal, is to up the pollination of the pears. And so what could I do about that to improve that situation? Well, the temperature, there's not much I could do about that. Food and water, I wanted to utilize the trees and the plants that I had in that garden. I could add some flowers, so I could add to the food as long as it's the right time of year and I had plenty of water. So I looked at what was blooming at that time. And with the pears, what time are the pears blooming? So which bee would be the right one for me? And then with nesting, what could I do about that? Well, that I could do something about. So I decided to take a look, and I was looking at the mason bee, because when the pear, so this one in the middle with the white blossoms, that's my pear tree, that's what's blooming now. So in April, this is what I saw. And so in April, I had peach tree, I had dandelions, pear tree. I've got maples in the yard, so within 300 feet of the pear tree. And then I've got strawberries that are now blooming, and then you can't really see it too well, but I did see some bumblebees. So those are actually in my yard. The one that's down below here, you can barely see the bumblebee there. And then I did have some plants that were attracting bumblebees, but I felt what I really wanted to work on was the pear. So I got mason bees. And that's what I decided. Since it was the fruit trees that I wanted to work with, on figuring that I had enough food because I have the maples, a pear, peach, I have the water and the mud, and some other dandelions. I had plenty of those. So I got a bee box or house. And this is one that just one style, but this is one that's basically reusable because it's got an open area here that I could put an insert, and I went with the insert. So I went with the Mason Bee team here with the Master Gardeners and did an insert. So you could do other things. There's straws. Let me show you a few different. So here are what straws look like. And here is a box with a little chicken wire to protect from birds and squirrels. And you can put the straws out, and you can see here that the mud that seals up the eggs when they're being made. Or here is what an insert looks like. So I got the box and the insert and the bee cocoons last year. And they went ahead and they pollinated my trees. And I went from 1 pear to about 35 pears, and I got more peaches and apples. So that was my experience with attracting pollinators. So I'm going to turn it over to you if you have any questions.
Let me look at the chat. Nothing in the chat. So anybody want to speak up? Nice talk, Catherine.
So again, you have lots of options on what you want to attract, but the one that I felt I had the most control over was the mason bee. And then one thing I will, when I was doing the research for this that I found, so as you're looking in your garden, if you see a bumblebee with a white rump, you see that? That is actually a Western bumblebee. And they are, I don't know if they're actually endangered, but they're looking for any information, if any spottings of the Western bumblebee. So if you see any around with the white rump, here is, they want it reported. And if you want, I've got some resources of what I used. And again, if there's any questions or comments, if you want to delve into, if you have any questions about your gardens, we can try and talk about that, see if we have any recommendations.
Anybody's questions? Wow, kite group tonight.
Oh, there's a second.
Oh, there we go. No questions. That was very informative. Wonderful. Any plants that might keep bees away?
Um, they don't necessarily keep them away, but they're not useful, like daffodils. Daffodils have no real food for the bees. They don't like, if you're doing the box, they don't like the smell of cedar until it's aged for quite a while. But I haven't heard of any plants that, would actually stop them. They may not use them, but that wouldn't like drive them away.
Okay.